Okay, hello, my friends. My name is Gerdes. I'm just a professor trying to help provide context in the war in Ukraine. These are the four big stories for today. So, Ukraine's top diplomat is in Beijing for talks on ending the war. I'm not optimistic that much is going to come from this, but it's a noble attempt. Let him try, let him see what he can get. If he can get anything, any movement, he's better off than where he was before he left for this trip. Ukraine's foreign minister was in China Tuesday. China presents itself as a neutral party. However, its deepening no-limits partnership with Russia has led NATO members to brand it as a decisive enabler. That happened just a week or two ago at the 75th NATO conference in Washington, D.C., of Moscow's war, which Beijing has never condemned. That's a good point. Beijing has never condemned the war. Kyiv and Kuleba's visit would focus on ways to stop Russian aggression, as well as China's possible role in achieving sustainable and just peace, which is what China says they're about. They say that they're about trying to have peace. Beijing has rebuffed claims that it is supporting Russia's war effort, although clearly it is with dual-use kind of materials that Russia is going to repurpose for military reasons or military purposes, insisting that last week its position was open and above board and accusing the West of fueling the conflict through arms shipments to Kyiv. Okay, Beijing may this week try to leverage this Ukrainian interest in a second peace summit in order to get itself off the hook for deepening sanctions. It does not want sanctions like that. That is very clear. Now, Borrell has talked, the EU's Joseph Borrell has talked about how Russia should be at the next peace summit, but not on Russia's terms, and we'll see how well that plays out. China is undoubtedly sustaining its overall support for Russia. There's nobody really disagreeing with that, said an assistant professor at a Chinese university. But there are signs that Beijing is getting increasingly wary of the diplomatic, political, and economic cost of its ongoing de facto support for Moscow. It's not really in China's interest. In a way, it is, in the sense that it's becoming more dominant on the continent than what Russia is, but in many ways, it's also interfering with just doing business. Okay, big story number 2. Ukraine's plan to survive Trump. So they're really thinking in terms that Trump could win. And now I know that things are happening like Kamala taking the place of Joe, but that doesn't mean that Trump is necessarily out, and they're trying to contingency plan for that. Officials in Kyiv have spent months gaming out what Donald Trump's victory could mean for their war against Russia. The first 8 or 10 months, basically all of 2025, would be very hard, a senior Ukrainian official tells Time, speaking on condition of anonymity to discuss internal deliberations. Trump would be likely to slash aid to Ukraine and push Zelensky to accept a peace deal skewed heavily in Russia's favor. Like previous U.S. presidents, Trump could also seek a reset in relations with Vladimir Putin at the start of his term. You remember famously Hillary's reset button with Lavrov? Worked like a charm, didn't it? Okay, but over time, he will see that Putin cannot be trusted. Trump will eventually realize that Putin can't care less about Trump and his agenda, and that's when we could start to see some advantages from Trump. He will not want to be played by Putin. Now, I know some people think, well, Putin is, got Trump in his pocket, or Trump's just a pawn of Putin, or doing whatever Putin wants. Trump is beholden to Trump's ego, and I think that's how it'll play. Now, how that'll play out, I don't know. He's a wild card. Okay, Zelensky and his allies have often complained that the U.S. response to the Russian invasion has been too slow under Biden, too hesitant, too distracted by fears of Russian escalation. It really has. Like, Biden's been there for him, but he's also put so many restrictions and slow-walked aid. So that's not been good, but it's been better than what could happen with Trump. So we're not exactly sure which way it's going to go or what's going to happen. A growing number of them believe that if Trump takes power and decides at some point to help Ukraine, U.S. support would become more decisive. So in Kyiv, there's a growing feeling that with Trump, that support would be more decisive than with Biden if Trump makes that turn and turns his face against it. Among those airing this prediction is Boris Johnson, the former British Prime Minister. Whatever some other Republicans may have said about Ukraine in the past, I believe that Trump understands the reality, and here it is, that a defeat for Ukraine would be a massive defeat for America. And if Trump interprets it in that way and processes that way and thinks through that way, I think you could see something significant change. I'm not betting on it, but it could. Johnson, whom Zelensky saw as his closest European ally at the start of the 2022 invasion, would not be alone in making such arguments to Trump. A clear majority of Republicans on Capitol Hill have voted for numerous aid packages to Ukraine, most recently in April when Congress approved the $61 billion in aid. Many traditional Republicans, including, that's not MAGA, that's like Reagan Republicans like me, including Mitch McConnell, the Senate minority leader, have been firm in their commitment to helping Ukraine win the war. In choosing his running mate last week, Trump sided with the more isolationist wing of his party. Senator J.D. Vance has been among the fiercest opponents of American involvement in Ukraine, but some in Kyiv maintain the hope that Vance, in the role of vice president, could also be swayed over time. It's going to be a tough sell. One potential link to Trump's circle for the Ukrainians has been Mike Pompeo, who served as the CIA Director and Secretary of State during Trump's first term. Pompeo, who has said that he would be open to taking a senior post in government if Trump returns to the White House, has also met with Zelensky. Okay, that's an article from Time magazine. Here's what The Guardian has to say about essentially the same issue. Ukraine targets bipartisan support to avoid being dragged into the U.S. election. They have to be really careful not to tick off either side. Ukraine will continue to reach out to Republicans and Democrats and avoid being sucked into U.S. internal politics. Zelensky paid a warm tribute to the departing Joe Biden on Sunday, thanking him for his unwavering support. Zelensky's administration has taken pains to pursue an even-handed approach to unpredictable and fast-moving events in Washington. Our official position is clear. We are looking for bipartisan support, one source said on Monday when he was declining to answer the question of whether Harris would, what Harris would mean for Ukraine or whether she would be good or bad or that sort of thing. Kyiv wants favorable decisions that would allow it to degrade Russian capabilities. The Biden administration has refused to allow long-range U.S. weapons to strike targets inside Russia, such as military airfields. Now, this is The Guardian putting this out. This isn't some Republican right-wing something. In April, the Washington Post said Harris raised these attacks during a private meeting with Zelensky at the Munich Security Conference. She reportedly urged him to stop blowing up Russian oil refineries, arguing that this tactic drove up global oil prices and invited Kremlin escalation. The request irritated Zelensky and his top aides. Harris has met Zelensky on 5 other occasions as vice president. Harris has been forthright in her support for Kyiv. During the 2020 election campaign, she condemned Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea. She opposed a 6-month delay by Congress of the Republicans in $61 billion Ukraine security package, and she described the Kremlin attacks on Ukraine civilians as crimes against humanity. So Harris has been a bit of a mixed bag, but she's probably going to do much of what the Biden administration previously had done. At the same time, Ukraine's leadership has made pragmatic overtures toward Republicans. Speaking in April, the foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba, told how Ukrainian deputies had wooed Mike Johnson, the Republican House Speaker, by inviting him to a prayer breakfast. Well, that was speaking his language. Trump has famously boasted that he will settle the Russo-Ukrainian war in a day. It's widely assumed that if he wins this autumn's U.S. presidential election, Trump will cut off aid, military and economic, to Kyiv. They say Trump is unpredictable and add that nobody quite knows what his Ukraine policy will be if he wins. I don't think Trump even knows what his policy will be if he wins, but he's a wild card. He could be terrible, but he might not be. I'm just not willing to gamble. The shocking assassination attempt against Trump in Pennsylvania in the previous weekend, Zelensky reached out, said, "I wished him, Trump, strength and absolute safety in the future." He posted that on X. He confirmed that they had all agreed to meet in person to discuss a fair and truly lasting peace. Now, when they meet, if they can meet in Ukraine, I think that could be game-changing, but I don't know that Trump would be willing to visit Ukraine during the election. Okay, meanwhile, the British Army chief says the UK must double its lethality or be prepared for war in 2027. Britain must be prepared to fight a war in 3 years' time and double the lethality of its army as the separate threats of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea come to a head, the new chief of the army has warned. I've seen these kind of ominous warnings about a 3 to 5 year time frame from numerous leaders, and it's starting to sound like they understand something that the rest of the world doesn't get. General Sir Rolly Walker, the chief of the General Staff, told reporters that the West faced an axis of upheaval that could lead to a significant detonation in another theater, perhaps Taiwan. The UK and its allies had to be ready to deter or fight a war within 3 years. In a subsequent speech, Walker said that he had a bold ambition for the Army to double our fighting power in 3 years and triple by the end of the decade. Not with extra resources, but by using technology and techniques developed on the battlefield in Ukraine, such as drones and artificial intelligence. So they got to catch up and learn the lessons that Ukraine has learned the hard way. Walker argued that we are not on an inexorable path to war, but added that what we do have is an absolute urgency to restore credible hard power in order to underwrite deterrence. That's a great line. The new Army chief's comments come at a time when the size of the British Army is at its smallest for 300 years, having donated tanks, missiles, artillery, and large amounts of ammunition to Ukraine, and will be interpreted by some as a plea for future investment in a service considered in the need of modernization. While the Labour government, elected just a few weeks ago, has agreed to lift defense spending from the current level of 2.32% of GDP to 2.5%, it is not committed to a firm timetable. But I'm telling you, I see this in all quarters where many European governments are saying, hey, we have to be prepared for 3 to 5 years out because something's brewing on the horizon. Last big story, EU and US near a deal on a $50 billion loan to Ukraine. That would be 20 from the US, 20 from the EU, and the other 10 divided among others. Last little bit, and this is important. Latvia started installing defensive barriers on its border with Russia. The so-called dragon's teeth were spotted near the easternmost Latvian town of Zalupi. You don't just do this for fun, for kicks and giggles. You do this because you're nervous about what your enemy or potential enemy might be thinking about. All right, my friends, that's all that I have. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.